Welcome to week one of our questions. I did a little introduction, but this is going to be getting right into the questions of the week and going through them. And I hope you listened to the welcome already and that we can get started with the questions. Okay, the first one is what makes the states different from one another? And I listed some of the characteristics here. Some of these are in the book, and they may all be in the book if I remember correctly, that the states differ a great deal on the basis of a number of characteristics, and I'll talk about some of them here. Size, you have very large states, large in terms of population and large in terms of geography. A really big state is the one right next to me, which is Texas, and that's enormously big in terms of geography. Not so much in terms of people, but in terms of the size. It's enormous. California is another state with a pretty big um, geography, very big actually. And then there's small states, like here. This is a tiny place, New Mexico. So, size makes a big difference. And it's has a lot to do with how sophisticated you are and how professional you are and some of the other characteristics that we'll talk about later. But size has a great deal to do with it. The fact that in Illinois, for example, Chicago is there, and it's one of the biggest cities in the whole United States, makes Illinois a pretty sophisticated place because you have Chicago with all the amenities that go with a big city, where here we don't have anything like that. The biggest city we have is Albuquerque, and that's about the size of Rockford, where I originally grew up as a kid, about 150,000 people. Santa Fe, which is where I live, and that's the capital, there's about 65,000 or so people that are here. And one of the things that you'd notice if you came here or lived here for a little while is that there's very little by way of industry or jobs other than service. So size has a lot to do with all kinds of things in terms of how one state would differ from another. Believe me, the state of New Mexico is dramatically different from Illinois. Age is another thing, and that means the age of the population. Do you have a lot of old people? Do you have a lot of young people? Do you have a lot of working age people? What kind of setting does the state find itself in terms of age? Um, and other things related to that would be like income and education. Age and education are pretty important. If people are going to be able to find jobs, they've got to have education. And if companies want to relocate to a state, they have to be able to know that they can hire people who are well educated enough to do the job in terms of whatever kind of occupation they're interested in. So the higher the income, the higher the education, the more likely the state is to be successful in terms of the economy of the state. So there's a great deal of variations. Like for example, here, when it comes to age, there's a lot of elderly people here because people don't come here to find jobs; they come here to retire. So you find that you have a lot of older people. I'm somebody in that category. I came here to retire. A lot of times when you get older, you don't want the big city anymore. You want kind of a slower pace, and you certainly find that in the Southwest, particularly here in New Mexico. But at the same time, I was able to find a more liberal population, which is kind of unique to the Southwest here in Santa Fe. I shouldn't say it's unique to the Southwest because there are places in Colorado like Boulder, and there are places even in Texas. There's Austin, Texas, which is more liberal than the rest of the state. So you find that uh, everything varies. You know, there's a tremendous variation in the United States, tremendous variation. Race and ethnicity is another one, another characteristic. Uh, how many minorities do you have? Here, the minorities are largely of two categories. One is American Indians, and the other is Hispanics. So you have mostly, I would say, Hispanics from Mexico, although you have Hispanics from other parts of South and Central America as well. Um, but you don't have a lot of African Americans here, or you don't have a lot of Asians here. It's small, and there just isn't such a tendency for a lot of minorities to gravitate toward the Southwest. It's either, yeah, it's kind of strange, you know, because I'm used to Chicago with all the diversity of a big city, which has everything. And you know that translates for me, like if one of the things is it translates into good restaurants. So for example, like in Chicago, you can find any kind of food. My favorite food is Ethiopian, and you don't have any Ethiopian restaurants here. You have very good Mexican restaurants, of course, with a the big debate about whether it's real Mexican or new Mexican or yeah, it's a whole lot of nonsense. But anyway, it's just different. Religion, a lot of Catholics here, whereas in Chicago or Illinois, you'd find every kind of faith possible. Here, you do find, a wide variety of religions, but the churches are, other than Catholic and Protestant, are going to be really small. Buddhist community here, I'm a Buddhist. The Buddhist community is pretty small, and so on. So, and that's, if you compared that to Chicago or you compared that to New York or you go to California, it's dramatically different. So every state is going to have a difference based on these characteristics and others that you might think of, because there's other characteristics too that a state would have that really affect it. One of the things that really negatively impacts us is the educational system here. There's a lot of poor people. That's another thing. The poverty level. How many people are below the poverty level here? A lot of American Indians. It's a really sad story. We kind of really messed up their culture, much like what we did to African Americans, bringing them over as slaves and not allowing them to have their own culture so much, making them forcing them to adapt to Euro-Western concepts and ideas, religion, and all the rest. And it wrecked them. It wrecked the American Indians. It wrecked the African Americans to a great degree, and it's just a mess. What we did is awful. Anyway, I see that here, that the poverty is so high. It's not high in Santa Fe or Albuquerque. If you come to these bigger cities, it's not bad. But when you get out in the rural areas, it's terrible. Anyway, just think about those things. Those are some of the characteristics, and like I said, you could probably think of more. Second question, how does state and local government impact individual citizens? Well, I put down three things here that you can see. One is laws regulating behavior. Now, the state and local governments are going to regulate us in terms of things like traffic and cars. So if you think traffic and cars, that's a good example. The reason I bring that one up is because it's in the book, and also it's common to all of us. Almost everybody drives. And so we're all subject to that. If you drive, you're subject to all the rules and regulations relating to driving. What are they? Such things as a driver's license. You have to have a driver's license, and you have to have insurance in order to drive. You have to, there are speed limits. Everywhere we go, we see speed limits. And so we're supposed to be obeying those. Another thing is like your car itself. The car itself, well, one of the things that you have in Illinois that you don't have here is the tinted windows, you know, the gangster car. Here you can have a gangster car, probably because the sun is out every single day, and people like the idea of shading their windows, not because they don't want somebody to look inside, or they don't want people to see them. It's more to keep the sun out and keep the heat out. So anyway, you can have those kind of what I call gangster cars, where the windows are so darkened you can't see who's inside. Where you can't do that in Illinois. Parking is another thing. There are all kind of rules about driving, if you think about it. Anyway, that's just one area. There are laws regulating just about everything we do. Second thing, and this is real obvious to people because they don't like the idea of taxes. That's a negative word in America. Kind of what I would call a political four-letter word, even though it's 5 letters. Anyway, taxes are a way to impact us. All governments, state, national, local, all have taxes. Here, mostly, as we'll see when we get into taxes in particular, that at the state level, it's the sales tax and the income tax, both those two. At the local level, it's the property tax. That's the basis. There's a sales tax as well. But at the state and local level, it's essentially the state using the sales tax and the local using the property tax. And then the third thing is services. What kind of services do you get? One of the things that you really should appreciate when you live in Chicago or Illinois is how well they keep the roads clean during the winter. Wintertime, there's a lot of bad weather in Illinois. Not so much here, but anyway, when you do have bad weather, they go out of their way to really keep it clean. Make sure that you can use the road to get to work. And it's a real challenge in a place like Illinois because the weather's not so good. Here it's not nearly as much of a challenge. They do a pretty good job. It was kind of surprising to me that what kind of a job they do in providing service of cleaning the snow. But it's not nearly the kind of challenge you face in Illinois because we live in a desert here, and there's not nearly as much precipitation. We could go months without getting any rain or snow or any precipitation at all. Anyway, those are the three things that I would say impact the individual citizen by the government. Laws and regulations, which are all over the place. They regulate every part of our activity. Think of the internet. Think of just about, if you want to buy something, it's all regulated. Taxes and services. The other thing I would say about services is it's very uneven. Some places you get a lot of services and other places you don't. It's changing. Chicago used to provide almost everything to taxpayers who lived in the city pretty much for free, like we mentioned. The city still provides stuff like snow removal and cleaning the streets and that sort of thing. But more and more places in Illinois and here as well have gone to privatization. So you pay for every service you get, like somebody to pick up your garbage. That's a private company here. Sewer, water, all these other things. You used to pay the city, and you used to pay very small amounts. And here, now that it's going more private, you pay more, and the prices seem to be going up all the time. So services are very uneven depending on where you live, and those services are less and less being paid for by the government, being paid for by our tax dollars. More and more it's being privatized, more and more. In other words, sold off to the city in Chicago. They even sold the parking an incredible thing, crazy, incredible thing to do. And the end result has been that the services are pretty awful. Privatization is not a good thing. It means we pay a lot more money, and we get less and less for what we pay for. Like here, the property taxes are low, much lower than they are in Illinois, but you don't get much. You have to pay for almost every service every service you get. I get bills for everything. Very little is provided by the county where I live. Number three, our state's uniquely different from one another, or how our state's uniquely different from one another. I listed here the political culture, the culture, their history, public expectations, and services. Well, the services I already talked about. It's very uneven, different from state to state. Some places you get a lot for your buck, a lot for your money, a lot for your taxes, and other places you hardly get anything. So services, like we don't have a whole lot of very good professional services, I would say. Where if you live in a big city, like for example the police here are not as professional, not as well trained. That's how professional would be described as they would be in a big city. They're not as experienced, they're not paid as well, and believe it or not, they make more mistakes. And you don't have as many of them. I mean, my God, I almost never see cops looking out for speeders or anything like that where I live because the population isn't dense enough. They have a lot of cops. Anyway, services, so I start at the bottom. Services are very, what I would call uneven. Some places there you get a lot, some places you get very little. I got a lot more when I lived in Illinois than I get here. The political culture. There's a description in the book about the political culture. I'll let you read that. I won't go into it in any kind of detail. Suffice to say that culture's different. One of the things that I certainly see here that I saw in Illinois was the political culture of corruption. There's a lot of people on the take. It's not a political machine as such, but there's just a lot of corruption here where you're expected, you expected to have payoffs, and you find politician after politician, with his hand in a cookie jar or her hand in a cookie jar. So that I see very similar to Chicago. Very different, say, from Wisconsin. If you look at Wisconsin, they're a kind of more of a culture where they don't have corruption to the degree that you have in Illinois or that we have here. A lot of that goes back to the culture itself. That means, like, what has been the history. Those things, political culture, the culture, and the history all kind of go together. The culture is generally what's the accepted norms of the state. What do people what are people like in terms of what they expect of one another and they expect of themselves and so on. Like, for example, with the culture here, one of the things that I see here that's very different from Chicago is it's very much more of a culture that's laid back. People are slower, they move slower, they are much more polite. If you drive down the street, I've been here for 4 years now. I lived here for 4 years. And I'm still driving a lot faster than everybody else. People do not do bumper to bumper kind of traffic stuff. If you're next to somebody, you kind of stay away from them. You stay way back. Whereas in a big city that I'm used to driving in Chicago, you would be close to the next car, even if you're on the expressway where you're driving at high speeds. You're right next to the car in front of you. And if you had to stop for some reason, you're thinking about veering off to the shoulder because you know you can't stop your car in time. So, but here it's very different. It's very much laid back. Um, you go to a store and there's a line, people will acknowledge the other people in front of you, you know, or around you. Or if there's some question about who's next in line, people will say, well, wait on him or wait on her. That's not something I ever saw in the city. People are a lot friendlier here. So that's the kind of culture. Like I said, it's good for me because I should be more laid back. I bring Chicago with me. More trusting. You can see a lot of times when people don't lock their house or lock their car, any of that kind of stuff, and you wouldn't dream of that in the city. You think right away that I'm in a hostile environment, whether you really are or not. And that's all part of the history and the culture because we see crime rates, we've been robbed, we've been mugged, whatever, you know, all of those kinds of things. Another thing would be public expectations. You know, what does the public expect of public officials? One of the things that happens in a place like here, in a place like Illinois, is the public doesn't have great expectations of their politicians, much less so than they would have of politicians in Wisconsin, where, again, what you expect is what you get. And Chicago's so used to corruption, so used to people on the take that they expect it. And it's the same thing here. And like I say, the politicians never let us down. They they continue to steal and rob and do whatever else they're going to do. Anyway, um, expectations are supposed to change as people get more educated. And I don't know if that's true or not. It just seems to me that we all become complacent, you know. After a certain amount of time, we just, regardless of whether we're educated or not, we just kind of become more alienated and cynical about what our role can be and whether we can be effective or not. And all of that has an impact. So every state is different based on these kinds of things. Every state, especially every section of the country. So if you come to the Southwest, you're going to find people a lot more outside because the weather is usually good and the sun is out. The sun is out almost every single day. It helps people's disposition. It's smaller, you know, less densely populated, so people are going to feel more relaxed. It's southern to a certain degree, so it's more laid back. Um, all of that, and then when you go to a place like Chicago or any big city, you know, even if I go to last place I was at, in a big city was in the United States was in Florida, you know, in Miami, Florida. That's the same thing. Same kind of thing. There's a real vibe of intensity. And so that's going to affect how people think and how they behave and react and all that kind of thing. So anyway, I hope I didn't wander off too much with that particular question. So the last one is, what's the most important functions of state and local government? And these are in the book and they're discussed in the book. And I listed them here in order of how much money the state spends on these things. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about them because the book does a good job of covering these things. But clearly the most important function of state and local government is education, because the state and the local governments are committed to giving everybody in the state a free public education from the time they're in kindergarten up to end of high school. They're committed to that. Plus, the state is committed to higher education. Public colleges and universities are generally in place to to give people at least they started out to give people a relatively free, or at least let's put it this way, a state subsidized college education. So that's a tremendous amount of education. And if you look at what's going on in education today, um, there's preschool as well as starting out in kindergarten. There's preschool, and so now many of the states are committing money, like they're doing here in New Mexico, committing money to preschool, free preschool education for kids, so that they get a better start, when they enter public schools. So that's really one of the things that, it's unique to the United States. No other country tries mass education like we do. And some people would argue that we're failing, but it's a noble cause. It's a noble effort. It's been part of the country's idea almost from the beginning, that you can't have democracy unless you have educated people. They can't make educated decisions unless they're educated. So all of that kind of thing, and we'll talk more about education later on in the class, but um, that's the most costly function. And then it's followed by these other things: health and welfare. The older the population gets, the more people you have that are retired and live longer, the more likely they are to need public assistance, because you can't. Most people don't take care of themselves. They're not like me. They're not taking good care of themselves, and they don't eat right. They don't exercise. A whole variety of things. We just went through this whole business about the soda tax, trying to get rid of obesity with these band-aids, like charging more money for a pop when people want to buy a sugary drink. Like that was the real problem, when it isn't. It's a whole series of things, which I could talk about, but I'll stay away from it now. Anyway, if you want, we can maybe make that a question we could talk about on the bulletin board. But anyway, health and welfare. And as people get older, they get sicker anyway, and they need more medications, and that's how the system works anyway. There's nothing about prevention. It's all about how do you handle diseases when people get them. And we're really in for trouble, because we've got this tremendously unbelievable number of people that are obese in the United States. And obesity leads to type 2 diabetes, and then all the problems that are associated with diabetes. And that just costs the government and the individual tremendous amounts of money, plus the medical system is way out of whack in terms of how much money that they charge. It's a real mess. Transportation, we talked a little bit about cleaning the roads, but building the roads and rebuilding the roads. You've got a bigger problem of rebuilding the roads in Illinois, because in order to keep the roads clean in the wintertime, they have to put a lot of salt down. And then when there's a lot of snow, they have to plow it. And plowing messes up the blacktop, or whatever the surface of the road is, and then creates potholes. And so all of that is very, very expensive and costs a lot of money. Public safety, mainly the police function. How do you protect the people? That's a big problem. Civil rights, protecting our rights to live as free individuals, which is becoming harder and harder these days. Physical environment, what does your environment look like? One of the things that's really nice here is when you drive down the street, we don't have billboards and all of that kind of stuff like you have in Illinois. My God, you go on to Stevenson or Kennedy or someplace like that, and it's just one billboard after another, and it's just so ugly. And here they don't do that. They, allow for the open environment for you to see the birds and the trees and everything else that's part of nature in living as it exists living in the desert. And the last thing is taxation. This is, we talked about that already, that they have to tax us. They have to raise the money in order to provide all these services that we're talking about here, education, health, and welfare, and so on. So anyway, I hope this was a good start to our questions, and that we that you learned something from it.